The trouble started with a chime, not the kind that makes you check your watch or wonder who's at the door. This one came from a carved mahogany grandfather clock that hadn't ticked in 30 years, until it rang out at precisely 7 p.m. On a Tuesday, and 30 seconds later, Lawrence Bartram dropped dead in his own library, with a glass of 12-year-old bourbon still cooling on his fingertips. I didn't witness the event, thank heaven. If I'd been there, Inspector Kramer would have had me cooling my heels in a precinct interrogation room instead of my own office armchair. And by my office, I mean the ground floor of Nero Wolfe's brownstone on West 35th Street, where I'm the one who does the legwork, dodges bullets, and answers the phone, while Wolfe himself solves murders without lifting anything heavier than a fork, unless he's forced to rise for a particularly disagreeable client. At 11:13 the next morning, Wolfe was in his orchid room, and I was at my desk going through bills. I had no intention of paying until someone threatened bodily harm. The phone rang. Wolfe hates when it rings during his plant time, but I answered anyway. That's my job, among other glamorous duties. "Goodwin," I said. The voice was female, smooth and tense like a cello string about to snap. "Mr. Goodwin, I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe. It's urgent, miss. Mr. Wolfe doesn't take calls before noon. Unless you're calling to report a fire in his orchid room, I'll have to pencil you in." There was a pause. Those fancy weighted silences women use when they think the silence will make you bend. I've dated women who could make silence feel like an uppercut. This one didn't quite reach that level, but she had potential. It's about my uncle, Lawrence Bartram. He's dead. I tapped my pen twice against the desk. The name rang a bell. Bartram was an investment mogul with a face made for newspapers and a reputation for busting unions and marriages with equal efficiency. And the police think it was natural causes. But I was there. Something was wrong. It was the clock. It hasn't worked in years. But it chimed, Archie. It chimed before he fell over. I leaned back, legs stretched, letting her words sink in. Wolfe had once solved a case based on a missing spoon. A mysteriously chiming antique was practically a confession written in blood. Name, Camilla. Bartram. I'm his niece. I'm also, she hesitated, which I liked, executor of his estate, and I want Mr. Wolfe to find out what really happened. I scribbled the details, then buzzed the orchid room. He'll bite my head off, I warned her. But I'll ask. Wolfe's voice came through the intercom like it had been dragged across gravel. Yes? A Miss Camilla Bartram just called. Her Uncle Lawrence croaked last night after a clock, chimed unexpectedly. She thinks it was murder. She also thinks you're the man to prove it. A pause. I do not investigate clocks, Archie, nor the fantasies of heiresses. She says she's executor of the estate. Another pause. Longer. Have her here at 2. No later. I turned back to the phone. Miss Bartram, congratulations. You've just scheduled an audience with the world's most immovable object. 2 o'clock sharp. Wear something conservative. He hates perfume. Thank you, Mr. Goodwin. I hung up, then reached for the stack of case files Wolfe had ignored for weeks. Something about a clock that shouldn't chime but did was giving me the chills. Maybe it was just my overactive imagination. Or maybe, just maybe, we were about to hear a murderer's hour strike. By the time 2 o'clock rolled around, the brown stone was humming with its usual rhythm. Fritz, our live-in chef and culinary deity, was prepping veal cutlets in the kitchen, and Wolfe had emerged from his orchid sanctuary in a mood best described as reluctantly tolerant. He was seated in his throne-like armchair, yellow silk, pyjamas replaced with his best charcoal grey suit, but the expression on his face suggested he'd still rather be repotting a Vanda tricolour. I was stationed in the front room when the bell rang. I opened the door to find Camilla Bartram standing there, with a look that said she was used to getting past velvet ropes and velvet-gloved excuses. She was tall in a way that didn't require high heels, though she wore them anyway. Pale grey coat, hair the colour of dark tea, pinned up in a style that screamed money but whispered class. Her eyes were clear, sharp, and deeply unimpressed by the likes of me, which made her more interesting than the usual heiress parade. "Miss Bartram," I said, "come in. The great man awaits." She stepped inside and took in the hallway's dark wood panelling like she was assessing a hotel she might buy and remodel. I ushered her into the office, where Wolfe barely nodded from his oversized armchair, eyes half-lidded, fingers steepled as if in silent prayer to the gods of deductive reasoning. "Miss Camilla Bartram," I announced, as if we were hosting royalty. Wolfe gave her a look one step warmer than lukewarm. "Sit, madam," he said, gesturing to the red armchair facing his desk. "State your business." She did, with poise, detail, and just enough tremor to imply sincerity without collapsing into melodrama. "Uncle Lawrence died last night, around 7, she began. "We were in his study, just the two of us. He was drinking bourbon and reading some trust documents. He was changing his will, or planning to. Then the clock in the corner, a Howard Miller from the 1800s, chimed. It hasn't worked since I was a child. It struck 7 times, and then he dropped dead." "Of what?" Wolfe asked, eyes closed now, which in his world meant he was listening with intent. "The coroner said heart failure. He was 78 but healthy. No prior heart issues. And the timing—" She stopped herself. "Something's wrong. I felt it instantly. That chime, it was too convenient." Wolfe opened his eyes. "Convenient? For whoever wanted him dead. That clock is decorative. It's been silent for decades. It shouldn't have chimed. And yet it did," Wolfe murmured. "I'm executor of the estate," she continued. "Uncle Lawrence's assets, stocks, property, several trust accounts will be divided. But I know him. He wouldn't have changed his will without telling me. Someone panicked. Someone pushed him, somehow. And the police? They're satisfied. Kramer, I think, is embarrassed to say anything else." Wolfe scowled. "Inspector Kramer is constitutionally incapable of embarrassment. He is, however, allergic to imagination. Do you believe me, Mr. Wolfe?" "No," Wolfe said bluntly. "Belief is a luxury I reserve for facts. But the clock, yes, that intrigues me. Will you take the case?" Wolfe looked pained, as if she'd asked him to shovel snow. "Miss Bartram, my aversion to professional activity is exceeded only by my aversion to stupidity. That said, if this clock indeed struck at a moment calculated by someone to create illusion or chaos, then it constitutes a riddle, and I dislike riddles left unsolved." I cleared my throat. "She's willing to pay," I added helpfully. Wolfe exhaled. "I assume you can afford my fee." "I'll match whatever you usually ask," she said. That earned her a proper lift of Wolfe's eyebrows. He gave a slight nod. Royal assent. I will look into it. Goodwin will visit the scene, examine the clock, and speak with anyone present in the house. I trust your memory of the event is unclouded. She bristled, but nodded. One more thing, Wolfe said. Who inherits the bulk of Bartram's estate under the current will? She looked at her gloves, as if suddenly remembering she was wearing them. My cousin, Vincent Tolland. He's not technically blood. He's Uncle Lawrence's step-nephew. They were close. I don't like him. Why not? I asked. Because he doesn't need money, and yet he always wants more. Wolfe's fingers flexed against the armrest like they were tapping out a tune only he could hear. His appetite for details was rising, and I knew the signs. He was in. That will be all for now, Wolfe said. Goodwin will begin his inquiries. I expect to know what the devil that clock was up to before the week is out. She rose, thanked us, and left with a perfume trail so faint even Wolfe didn't object. I looked over at the boss. You don't believe it was a heart attack? No, Archie, Wolfe said. I believe it was a performance. Someone arranged a bit of theatre, and our job is to find out who wrote the script. Thursday morning, I traded my best tie for one that looked respectful but not flashy, and grabbed the keys to the Heron sedan. Wolfe doesn't like me driving unless there's food or blood involved. In this case, we had the scent of both, bourbon and a corpse. So I was cleared to leave the premises. Bartram House sat on the northern edge of Riverdale, a stone and timber monstrosity with views of the Hudson and enough real estate to require a staff just to dust the windowsills. The front gate buzzed open after I gave my name, and a balding butler with the moral rigidity of a Buckingham Guard showed me through. The study was everything Miss Bartram had described. Dark wood, heavy curtains, wall-to-wall shelves of old, books with titles like The Nature of Capital and Trusts, Wills, and Other Weapons. But what caught the eye was the grandfather clock in the corner, 6.5 feet of carved oak, with a pendulum encased behind glass and an etched brass dial that stared back at you like it knew more than it should. I checked the hands. 11:23. It wasn't running. The pendulum was still. Has anyone touched the clock since the night Mr. Bartram died? I asked the butler, who introduced himself as Greaves, in the tone of a man who disapproves of unnecessary questions. No, sir. Mr. Bartram insisted it remain as is. Decorative only. The mechanism hasn't worked since I began here 10 years ago. And yet, Tuesday night it chimed. Greaves nodded once, precisely at 7. Anyone else in the house at the time? Miss Camilla, of course, Mr. Vincent Tolland and his wife, Margot, also the maid, Marcy, and myself. Mrs. Winslow, Mr. Bartram's private secretary, had already gone for the day. I jotted names and a few notes. Greaves didn't like it, but Wolfe had trained me well in ignoring butlers with backbones, was admiring the clock face when the door creaked open and a man stepped in like he was used to owning rooms. Mid-30s, tall, gym-built, expensive haircut. He wore a navy blazer and an expression that was either grief or annoyance. I wasn't close enough to decide which. "You're the detective?" he asked. "Wolfe's gopher." "Archie Goodwin," I said, offering a smile that didn't reach all the way up. "And you must be Vincent Tolland." "Correct. You're wasting your time here, Goodwin. My uncle was old, and he died. People do that." "Sure, I said, but most don't time it with a musical number. That got a flicker from him, barely a smirk. I heard the clock too, he said, thought I was imagining things, and then he collapsed. Convenient, I said. He dies just before changing his will. That must have been a relief. He stepped closer, eyes narrow. You know what's worse than an uncle with too much money? A niece with too many suspicions. Camilla wants this to be something it isn't. She's always had a flair for drama. Drama's my business, Mr. Tolland. You know if the will was actually changed? No clue. He was tight-lipped about that stuff. Said he was reviewing it, then he dropped dead. End of review. Where were you when it happened? In the sunroom. Margot and I had just come in from a walk. Anyone vouch for that? Bien sûr. Smile didn't reach his eyes. She can. I didn't like him. He was too smooth, too prepared. And he didn't once ask how Wolfe planned to solve the mystery. Because he didn't care. Either he already knew what happened, or he didn't think it mattered. Next up, the maid. Marcy was in the kitchen, chopping carrots like they'd personally offended her. Late 20s, local accent, chip on her shoulder. Yeah, I heard the clock, she said before I even asked. Thought maybe we had a ghost, and then I heard Miss Bartram scream. Did you go to the study? Nope, not my place. Greaves ran in. I followed after. Mr. Bartram was already gone. Had he been acting strange lately? She shrugged. He never acted not strange. Always talking to himself, reading old contracts, watching people like he was mentally editing them out of his will. He was sharp, though. Too sharp. Sharp enough to suspect someone might want him dead? She looked at me. He told me something once, 2 weeks ago, said, if anything happens to me, it won't be an accident. Then he laughed and poured himself another bourbon. Did you tell anyone? She snorted. Who's gonna believe the maid? I got her number and promised to keep her out of the headlines. Then I headed for the garage. Greaves had said Bartram kept a small collection of clocks in there that he'd tinkered with before his eyesight began to fade. I was halfway across the drive when I spotted someone in the window. Second, floor, left wing, female, pale still, watching me. The second I looked up, the curtain twitched and she vanished. A woman in the house who wasn't on the list. Or just a nervous wife spying out of habit. Either way, I now had more questions than Wolfe's pantry had condiments. I drove back to the brownstone with a page of notes and a gut full of bad vibes. Wolfe was waiting in his chair, sipping beer and eyeing me like I was late for confession. Well, he said, I met the clock. It's still not talking. But there's a cousin who stands to gain, a maid who doesn't trust anyone, and at least one ghost in the window. Wolfe grunted. Ghosts I do not accept, Archie, but secrets I accept in bulk. By the time I got back to the brownstone, the clock in our office read 4:32, though unlike Bartram's, ours didn't wait decades to perform its duty. Wolfe, having finished his post-lunch beer and orchids, was seated with his bulk centred like the earth around which we all revolved. I handed over my notes, which he barely glanced at. So, he said, Bartram's study clock chimed for the first time in decades, precisely when he dropped dead. Correct. And no one has touched it since. Not unless they've mastered telekinesis. Tell me about the people. I gave him the rundown. Vincent, the nephew, charming as a coiled viper. Margot, his ghost wife, I hadn't met her yet, but I suspected she'd be as warm as a banker's handshake. The butler, Greaves, ran the house like a tight ship, and the maid, Marcy, was sharp enough to be dangerous if underestimated. Neither, of course, Camilla, our client whose suspicions had a scent Wolfe could smell across borough lines. And there was a watcher, I added. Second-floor window, female, blonde, I think. Vanished when I looked up. Wolfe grunted. Mrs. Toland, presumably, or someone who doesn't want to be seen. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. Camilla said the will was being reviewed. Find out if it was changed. Working on it, I said. But guess what? The lawyer, Bartram's personal counsel, just happens to be out of town this week on a trout fishing expedition in Vermont. Wolfe sighed. Fish, Archie, are the enemy of justice. I was about to offer a rebuttal when the phone rang. I grabbed it. Nero Wolfe's residence, Archie Goodwin speaking. There was silence on the other end. Then a click. Then the line went dead. I looked at Wolfe. Wrong number, he asked. Wrong caller. He raised one eyebrow, which for Wolfe is the equivalent of a full-body shiver. Trace it. I nodded, already dialing the operator. 5 minutes later, I had the info. The call came from a payphone outside a drugstore in the Bronx. Useless, unless our phantom caller had the courtesy to leave fingerprints. I passed it on anyway, just in case. Then came the real kicker. Around 6, Nick, just as Fritz was prepping dinner, and Wolfe was mentally committing his menu to memory, the doorbell rang again. I opened it to find Camilla Bartram, again, but this time she wasn't alone. With her stood a woman in her mid-40s, red-lipped, sharp-eyed, with a posture that suggested she hadn't relaxed since Reagan's first term. She introduced herself as Mrs. Dora Winslow, Bartram's personal secretary. I need to speak to Mr. Wolfe, she said, voice clipped like a banker's telegram. We brought them in. Wolfe did not stand, he never does, but he did wave her to a chair. Mr. Wolfe, she began, I didn't tell Miss Bartram everything when we spoke after the funeral, but something's come up. This morning, I opened the safe in Mr. Bartram's private filing room. He used to keep a secondary will there, a draft he'd been working on for the past 6 months. It's missing. That got Wolfe's full attention. You're certain it was there? He asked. I typed it myself, she said, on a royal typewriter older than my marriage. He'd been making changes, removing certain allocations to, let's say, less deserving parties. But the original will, the one being executed now, still names Vincent Toland as primary beneficiary. Why didn't you mention this before? Wolfe asked, already irritated. Because I didn't want to throw gasoline on what was already a house fire. But this morning I also found this. She opened her purse and slid out a single envelope, plain, unmarked. I opened it, carefully. Inside was a single strip of paper, clipped from what looked like a magazine, with ransom note-style letters pasted onto it. Stop digging, or the next chime's yours. Camilla gasped. Wolfe stared at it, lips pursed. Where did you find this? I asked. In my desk drawer. I don't know how it got there. Has anyone else seen it? No. Camilla sat forward. You think someone killed Uncle Lawrence? And now they're threatening her. Wolfe made a sound deep in his throat, something between a sigh and a warning bell. Yes, he said, and no. The note is crude, amateurish, designed to frighten. It tells us two things. The missing will was discovered, and someone considers its contents dangerous. Likely, someone who benefits from the original. I raised an eyebrow. Vincent! Wolfe didn't answer. He never speculates out loud unless the odds are excellent. He looked to Mrs. Winslow. I want a copy of the draft you typed. Do you have one? She hesitated. Yes, at home, but I'll bring it tomorrow. Do so, Wolfe said, and for your own safety, do not remain alone in the Bartram house. And where should I stay? She asked. Wolfe turned to Camilla. You trust her? Yes. Then you will host her. Temporarily. Camilla nodded, though her face said she'd just agreed to adopt a cat with a mean streak. The women left, leaving behind silence and the faint trace of rose perfume. I turned to Wolfe. A threatening note, a missing will, a clock that wakes from the dead just in time for a man to collapse. Wolfe took a long drink from his beer. All artifice, Archie. Someone has composed a story. Our task is to read between the lines. The warning started, the way most days do when you're on Wolfe's payroll, with Fritz making eggs that would make angels weep, and Wolfe being irritated by the concept of interruption. We were halfway through breakfast. Poached eggs with tarragon cream, coffee strong enough to reanimate a corpse, when Wolfe, in his infinite charm, pushed his plate back with a grunt of disdain. I knew the grunt. It meant something had soured his appetite, and considering Fritz's record, it wasn't the food. This case, he said, stabbing his napkin into his lap like it had personally betrayed him, is an affront. I waited, chewing politely. That was my contribution to the conversation, until he chose to elaborate. I have endured interruptions, vulgar clients, and that hideous note. But now I am expected to unravel a mystery wrapped in amateur theatrics and social imbecility. Archie, I refuse. I looked up. You're quitting. Correct. Miss Bartram has been dishonest by omission. Mrs. Winslow withheld critical information, and I am expected to continue under the impression that a grandfather clock has gained sentience. That clock did chime. I don't doubt it, but I am not a conjurer, Archie. I do not investigate mysteries designed by buffoons with glue and scissors. You think the note was fake? He closed his eyes, exhaled, and inched his chair back. I think it was clumsy, purposefully dramatic, and I think whoever left it believed a threat without substance could still misdirect us. Which means, he growled, someone in that house thinks fear is an effective strategy. And they may be right. But I detest being played. He stood. Wolfe stood. That's how you knew it was serious. I am suspending all work on this case until a proper motive or a proper fee is presented. Fritz poked his head in from the kitchen. Yes, sir. Inform Miss Bartram that Mr. Wolfe is no longer available for theatrics. Now, let me explain something. When Wolfe throws a fit, it isn't loud. It's cold, controlled, the emotional equivalent of a tax audit. But in this case, it meant I had to call Camilla and tell her that the genius she hired had declared war on the entire concept of mystery solving. She didn't take it well. You can't quit, she said. You saw the note. I saw it. Wolfe read it, sniffed it, and declared it beneath his standards. This is absurd. You think someone faked a death threat to throw you off? I think, I said, that your uncle's killer may be the kind of person who reads dime store crime novels and thinks glue sticks and typeface swaps are clever. She was silent for a beat. Then maybe this will change your mind. Chérie, me, I found something in the attic this morning, something I wasn't supposed to find. I leaned forward. Keep talking. There's a second copy of the will, not the original one and not the draft. It's dated 3 days before Uncle Lawrence died. It's unsigned, but it's typed. Same language as the draft Mrs. Winslow prepared. It clearly cuts Vincent out of most of the estate. And in the margin, there's a note in his handwriting, "Deliver to Abbott Monday morning." I felt the temperature in the room drop 3 degrees. Abbott? That's the lawyer who's trout fishing in Vermont. Exactly. And the envelope the copy was in? It was addressed, but never mailed. Camilla, I said, already reaching for my coat, put it somewhere safe and don't tell anyone else. I'll be there in an hour. I hung up and turned to Wolfe, who was already back in his chair, glowering into a second beer. Wolfe, I said, she found a new draft, unmailed, signed in the margin. I am uninterested, he said, eyes closed. She also found a receipt from a clock repairman. He opened one eye. I smiled. Bartram had the clock serviced the week before he died. Both eyes opened. That wasn't in any statements or interviews, I said. Greaves said the clock hadn't worked in 10 years. Bartram must have kept it secret. Wolfe leaned forward slightly, which for him is the equivalent of a man leaping out of his chair. Bring me the name of the repairman and the draft. So, we're back on the case? He sighed. I will tolerate deception. I will tolerate incompetence. I will not tolerate a chiming clock that lies. That was as close to welcome back as I was going to get. If there's one thing I've learned from working with Nero Wolfe, it's that a man will do damn near anything for money, pride, or the right to sit in a chair no one else can afford. Uncle Lawrence Bartram had one of those chairs, a metaphorical one, and someone clearly wanted to yank him out of it before he changed the seating arrangement. By the time I got to the Bartram house, the air had that thick, unspoken tension that usually settles in after a death, but before the will reading. You know, when relatives start circling each other like hyenas around an injured antelope. Camilla met me at the door with the same intensity she'd walked in with the first time. Eyes sharp, voice low. Upstairs. Attic. I followed her past. The grandfather clock, which was silent again, as if it had done its job and now preferred retirement. And up the back stairs to a narrow hallway and a pull-down ladder that looked like it hadn't seen daylight since the Hoover administration. Found this yesterday afternoon, Ishi said, handing me a thick manila folder. Inside were 2 things, the unsigned will draft, typed, margin noted, and a receipt. Wolfe had been right again, which, if we're being honest, is less a surprise and more of a universal law. The receipt was dated 1 week prior to Bartram's death, and came from a guy named Elias Trigg, a clockmaker in Red Hook, paid in cash. Bartram had the clock repaired but didn't tell anyone, I said. He must have wanted it to be a surprise. Yeah, one hell of a surprise. But that wasn't the twist. That came when I turned to the final page of the will, because there, just below the typed closing line, was a signature, Lawrence E. Bartram, signed in ink, Clean. No smudges. Camilla, I said, trying to keep my voice even. You said this wasn't signed. I swear it wasn't. Last night when I opened the envelope it was blank. I even showed it to Mrs. Winslow. You're telling me it signed itself overnight? No, I'm telling you someone else did. We stared at each other for a second. Who else knows you found this? I asked. No one. Does anyone else have access to this attic? Technically, everyone. The ladder isn't locked. Great. I took photos with my phone, both of the signature and the receipt, and slid the originals back into the envelope. Come with me, I said. You're not staying here tonight. She hesitated. I can't leave the house. Not with everything. Then lock the attic. Keep the draft with you, and don't tell anyone, not even Winslow, you found it. I still trust her. That's sweet. Trust gets people killed. She glared. I didn't care. Back at the brownstone. Wolfe was waiting in his office, surrounded by the scent of orchids and a stack of books he hadn't touched all day. I handed him the photos. He studied the signature with the expression of a man being forced to sniff spoiled milk. This is not the same hand, he said. You think it's forged? I know it is. The pressure is inconsistent. The loops are false, and, most damning of all, Bartram signed with a flourish. This is deliberate. Controlled. So someone wanted the will to look valid, I said, but not too closely. Indeed, and whoever it was likely panicked, fearing the missing draft would implicate them if found unsigned. They hoped the illusion of completion would dissuade inquiry. Too late, Wolfe nodded slowly. There's more, I added. The clock was repaired last week. Paid in cash. No record but the receipt. That chime, he murmured, wasn't coincidence. It was a trigger. The killer intended it. To cover the sound of the murder? Perhaps, or perhaps to mark it. He stood, again a rare event, and began pacing, hands behind his back. We must speak to Mr. Trigg immediately, and retrieve the original signature specimen of Mr. Bartram. That'll take time. Then begin now. I headed out, already dialing the number listed on the receipt. Trigg answered on the third ring, voice raspy with a heavy Brooklyn bite. Yeah, I fixed that monster clock. Week ago. Big fella paid. Me cash. Big fella. Tall, wide shoulders. Nice coat. Not the old man, though. You're sure? Buddy, I know dead guys when I see 'em. This guy was younger, 45 maybe. Didn't give his name. I hung up, turned around, and marched right back into the office. Wolfe, I said. The guy who brought the clock in wasn't Bartram. Tall, wide-shouldered, nice coat. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Vincent Tolland, he muttered. But why? To make sure it chimed at the exact right moment? Wolfe didn't answer, but he didn't have to. Somewhere between the forged signature and the ticking clock, this thing had stopped being about a dead millionaire and started being about a murderer with a very precise sense of timing. Wolfe once told me that most men hang themselves with verbs, not nouns. A noun might hide behind ambiguity, but a verb does. It moves, and when it moves in the wrong direction, he notices. I didn't understand what the hell that meant until that evening, when we had our little chat with Mrs. Winslow. It wasn't an interrogation. That would have required Wolfe to show emotional investment. No, it was more of a slow, precise verbal ambush. We'd invited her over under the pretense of reviewing the earlier draft she'd typed for Bartram. She arrived just after 6, in one of those tailored coats that say Executive Assistant on the outside and Don't Cross Me on the inside. Wolfe offered her a chair, gestured toward the envelope on the desk, and sat in silence while she adjusted her gloves. "Miss Winslow," he said finally, "you recall this document?" She nodded. "I prepared it. It was a working draft. Lawrence never signed it." "Are you certain?" "Of course. And this marginalia. Deliver to Abbott Monday morning. Is it in your hand?" She gave it a glance. "No, that's his." Mr. Bartram liked to leave reminders for himself. Wolfe nodded. "And who else saw this draft before yesterday?" "No one. It stayed in the drawer in his study until I put it in the envelope and sealed it." "But you didn't mail it." "I forgot." Wolfe's eyes slid shut. Now, here's the part that got interesting. She leaned forward and added, Vincent insisted it be mailed right after the funeral, but I felt it would be better to let things settle." Wolfe's eyes opened. "You say Mr. Tolland insisted?" "Yes." "His words?" "He said it made no sense to delay legal matters. He wanted everything squared away." Wolfe's hand twitched, barely perceptible, then returned to stillness. I recognized that twitch. It was the equivalent of an earthquake under 5 tons of marble. "What exact phrase did he use?" Wolfe asked. "I told you. Squared away." Wolfe turned to me. "Archie, do we have the transcript from Mr. Tolland's earlier statement?" "In my bag. Fetch it." I got it." Wolfe took the page, skimmed to a section, and read aloud. "I told Camilla to make sure the lawyer handled everything. I didn't want any of it hanging over us. That will draft was just sitting there, unsigned. I figured it should be sorted." Wolfe turned the paper over, placed it on his desk, and steepled his fingers. "That's not the same phrasing," he said. Mrs. Winslow blinked. "I don't understand." "No," Wolfe said mildly. "You don't?" There was a pause. Mrs. Winslow shifted in her seat. I could see it now. Wolfe wasn't chasing facts anymore. He'd found something, a thread, and it wasn't in a document or a drawer. It was in how someone spoke. After she left, I gave him the look I reserve for when I know he knows something and isn't sharing. "All right," I said. "Out with it." "That woman," Wolfe murmured, "is lying." Because of a phrase, because of a change. Tolland doesn't speak in euphemism. He's blunt. Sorted is what a man like that says. Squared away is what someone else thinks he would say. "Winslow?" She fabricated the quote, to make it seem like Vincent was eager to see the draft mailed. "But why?" "That," Wolfe said, rising with the slow deliberateness of a submarine surfacing, "is the precise question we must answer. But consider, if the signature is forged and the draft was tampered with, what better way to cast suspicion than to imply Tolland was pushing for its delivery? You think she planted it to frame him?" "I think she is framing someone. Perhaps Vincent, perhaps not. But she knows more than she's said." He turned toward the dining room, where dinner waited, and Fritz's patience wore thin. "We must speak to Camilla again. Tonight." And then the phone rang. I picked up. A voice, panicked, breathless. "Archie? It's Camilla. Something's wrong. I think someone's been in the attic again." "What happened?" "I locked it like you said. I even kept the key on me. But the door was open when I got back from the store. And the envelope. It's gone. Wolfe was already standing. 2 in one day. Call Guinness. Stay there, I said. Don't touch anything. We're on our way. I hung up and looked at Wolfe. He already had his coat in hand, with the reluctant air of a man preparing to have dinner interrupted by murder. That envelope, he said, is more dangerous than a pistol. And whoever took it? I asked. They're about to learn it's loaded. If there's anything more stubborn than Nero Wolfe refusing to leave the brownstone, it's Inspector Kramer charging into a case with a theory he thinks smells like roses when it's really a barrel of week-old haddock. And tonight, the man had his bouquet. We pulled up to the Bartram house a little after 8. The place was lit up like Times Square, and not because anyone was feeling festive. A black and white squad car was angled across the curb, and a second unmarked sedan, the kind driven by cops who think plain clothes make them invisible, was parked halfway on the lawn. Inside, Camilla met us at the door, pale and shaky. "Upstairs," she whispered. "They're already here." "They," Wolfe said. "Kramer. And he brought 2 uniforms. They're talking to Vincent." I didn't wait for Wolfe's opinion on that. He wasn't about to sprint up any stairs, and I wasn't about to miss the show. I headed up and found the scene unfolding in the second-floor study. Kramer stood with his fists on his hips, chewing what was either gum or frustration. Vincent Tolland sat on the edge of a high-backed chair, his coat off, tie loosened, and the kind of look on his face that says, "I thought you people only knocked on doors in bad neighborhoods." One of the uniforms was bagging the empty envelope Camilla had described. The other was standing near the door, like he expected someone to bolt. "Goodwin," Kramer said, spotting me. Just who I didn't want to see. "Evening, Inspector. Is this an official 'you messed up my theory' greeting, or just personal affection?" Kramer grunted. "We found him coming down from the attic. The draft's missing. The door was locked until it wasn't. Tolland says he never had a key. That's funny, because Camilla swears she had it in her purse all day." "She did," Camilla said from behind me. Kramer turned. "Then explain how the envelope's back in the study, empty, and how this guy was the only one upstairs when it happened." Vincent stood up, palms out. "I told you. I went to get my jacket. I didn't go near the attic." "Sure, jackets always hide next to broken locks." That's when Wolfe finally made his appearance, slow and wide like a thundercloud rolling in over a barbecue. "Inspector," he said, "if you're done playing pin the tail on the nearest suspect, I suggest you consider the following. Vincent, Tolland would have no need to return a draft he allegedly stole, unless he were a fool." "Is he a fool?" Vincent straightened. "No, sir." "Then why, Inspector, would he re-enter a locked room to bring back the very thing he's accused of taking?" Kramer folded his arms. "Guilt makes people stupid." "That's stupid," Wolfe said. "And the envelope being in the study doesn't confirm its route, only its destination." I cleared my throat. "Not to mention," I added, "the envelope had no document in it. If Vincent had gone through all the trouble of slipping it back, don't you think he'd have stuffed it with something? A blank page even?" Kramer scowled. "So what's your theory, wise guy?" "No theory," Wolfe said smoothly. "Just observation. Miss Winslow." "Where is she?" I asked, looking around. Camilla blinked. "She left just before you arrived. Said she needed air." Wolfe gave a low sound. Not quite a sigh, not quite a grunt. The sound of a man recognizing a piece of a puzzle slotting quietly into place. "Inspector," he said, "Miss Winslow's departure was not coincidental. She has the draft. Or destroyed it. That's a hell of a claim." "Prove me wrong," Wolfe said, and turned on his heel toward the stairs. Kramer, to his credit, didn't call for Vincent's arrest, but he also didn't stop glaring as we exited the room. Back in the car, Wolfe sat silently, stewing in thought. The Bartram house receded behind us like a sinking ship, bright, noisy, and full of people pretending they weren't bailing water. "So," I said, once the engine purred down the avenue, "Winslow's the inside operator." "She's someone's operator," Wolfe said, "but the gears are still misaligned." "You mean the motive? I mean the timing, the clock." "You think she tampered with it?" "No," Wolfe said softly. "I think she knew it would, chime, and when, which means someone told her, and that someone is the murderer." He closed his eyes. "Tomorrow," he said, "we call them all to the brownstone, all the players, all the pretenders. One of them set the stage for murder with a clock. Let's see if they can keep time under pressure." There's a particular atmosphere that settles over Wolfe's office when a full cast of suspects is gathered, under the pretense of clarifying outstanding details. It's not exactly a firing squad, but no one ever leaves feeling untouched, especially not the guilty party. At precisely 4 o'clock the following afternoon, our chairs were arranged, the beer was cold, and Wolfe was planted in his oversized throne behind the desk. Broad, serene, and as immovable as a cathedral, I stood near the globe by the window, notebook in hand, ready to play my part. Occasional interjections, sarcastic flourishes, and, if required, chasing someone down a hallway. In the front row sat Camilla Bartram, fidgeting with her gloves. Vincent. Tolland leaned forward, knuckles on his knees, all business and tension. To his left was Claude Abbott, whose lawyer had advised him to attend for the sake of cooperation. The lawyer stayed in the car. Behind them, looking vaguely bored, was our last-minute addition. Camilla's aunt, who had apparently overheard more than she let on during our first visit, and now wanted clarity. Wolfe doesn't like late characters, but he made an exception. He claimed she might be useful as a barometer of guilt. Then came the grand entrance. Marjorie Winslow. She was the last to arrive, hair done tighter, face drawn thinner. She didn't ask to sit. She simply did. Wolfe opened with his usual slow burn. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've indulged my request, and I shall reward you with brevity. Mr. Bartram's death was no accident, no suicide, and certainly no coincidence. It was murder." "No," one gasped. In fact, if there had been a reaction more subdued than silence, we'd have seen it. Wolfe steepled his fingers. The clock in the study chimed at exactly 7 p.m., drawing the attention of Camilla Bartram and Vincent Tolland. That timing was essential. The murderer needed both of them to find the body together, ensuring shock, chaos, and the absence of a timeline wide enough to permit cool, rational suspicion. He turned to Camilla. "You were in the dining room?" She nodded. "Yes, I was, preparing wine. And you, Mr. Tolland, were—" "In the parlour," Vincent said, "looking at old photo albums." Wolfe let that hang for a second before continuing. The murderer placed the body in the study just minutes before the clock chimed. Not long before, not hours, mere minutes. Why? Because Lawrence Bartram had to be alive when the rest of you believed him to be dead. Abbott shifted uncomfortably. I resent. You may resent freely, Wolfe interrupted, but I assure you, you will be more offended by the facts than by my manner. That shut him up. Wolfe pressed on. The forged draft was planted in the attic, to be discovered after the will's proper reading. That is what the murderer intended, but someone got there first. Camilla, in a moment of doubt, retrieved it too early, and that disrupted the killer's plan. Camilla looked stricken. I didn't know it would matter. It did, tremendously. The killer needed the draft to appear organically, at the proper time. When it was found, too, soon they took a risk, returning to the attic to steal it back. That's when Wolfe turned to. Marjorie Winslow. She didn't blink. You were the only person to leave the house yesterday evening, immediately after the attic discovery. Marjorie met his gaze. And you lied about Vincent Tolland's phrasing. You quoted him incorrectly to imply urgency, to shift suspicion. You forged the draft, and you forged Bartram's signature. Still no reaction. Do you deny it? A pause. Then, yes, absolutely. Wolfe exhaled, deep, patient, grave. Then perhaps you can explain how, in your quote, you used the term squared away. A phrase not uttered by Mr. Tolland at all, but frequently by Mr. Bartram himself, documented in his correspondence, including the marginal note on the draft. Her eyes narrowed. You didn't quote Vincent. You paraphrased Lawrence, because that's whose voice you heard in your head when fabricating his final wishes. There it was. A blink, a swallow. Not confession, yet, but the tectonic shift of someone cornered by language. Wolfe lifted a hand. I could continue. About the motive, unrequited devotion, the humiliation of being overlooked in the will, the risk of exposure when Bartram discovered the forgery. But I shall wait. You will speak soon enough. Mr. Goodwin? I stepped forward, flipping open my notebook. I'll be calling the police now. That made Marjorie stand, but she didn't run. She just stared at Wolfe and said quietly, but not weakly, You're wrong. To which Wolfe replied, That is possible, but unlikely. There's a particular smell that creeps into the room when Nero Wolfe is about to nail the guilty party to the wall. It's not fear, at least not right away. It's tension, cold and stale, like a draft from a basement door that hasn't opened in years. Everyone starts to feel it, especially the one person in the room trying not to blink too fast. Marjorie Winslow was still standing, her chin tilted, defiance in her spine. She had poise, I'll give her that. But poise is just posture without defence, and Wolfe was already circling. He leaned back in his chair, letting the silence linger just long enough to crack it. I did not name Miss Winslow as the murderer, Wolfe said at last, only as the forger of the will. The distinction is critical. Marjorie looked ready to snap at that, but Wolfe's hand lifted again, just a twitch of the wrist, and she froze. No, Wolfe continued, the murder required more than deception. It required physical strength, timing, and a lack of scruples so complete, even Miss Winslow's ambition falls short. Claude Abbott made a sound that wasn't quite a cough. Wolfe's gaze shifted, slow and unblinking. "Yes, Mr. Abbott. You—" "Sir." Abbott straightened. "This is absurd." "It would be, if not for your shoes." Claude blinked. "I beg your pardon?" Wolfe gestured toward the side table. "Archie?" I handed him the small plastic bag we'd tucked into my coat pocket on the way out of the Bartram house this morning. It held a torn scrap of fine paper and a single thread of carpet fibre. "Camilla vacuumed the attic early yesterday afternoon. It was spotless. Yet we found this, torn from the edge of the forged draft, near the attic door this morning, along with a trace of red wool fibre." Wolfe turned to Camilla. "You have no red rugs in your home?" "No," she said quickly. "Only navy and beige." Wolfe nodded, turned back to Abbott. "Your study, however, is fully carpeted in crimson wool. And your alibi? Conveniently vague." Claude's jaw tightened. "This is circumstantial." "Is it?" Wolfe tilted his head. "Let's examine motive. You've spent the last 10 years entwined in Lawrence Bartram's financial affairs. You were aware of his decision to revise his will, cutting you out entirely. You couldn't risk the truth emerging, not just about your exclusion, but about the funds misappropriated under your watch. Bartram wasn't just disinheriting you, Mr. Abbott, he was preparing to expose you." Claude was pale now, but still sitting tall. "I didn't kill him." "You did, and you used the clock." More murmurs now. I caught Vincent shifting in his seat. Wolfe pressed on. Bartram had recently repaired the antique chime clock himself. He boasted about it in a letter to his sister, noting it now struck 7 5 minutes early. That quirk was essential to your plan. You knew Bartram worked in the study each evening before dinner. At precisely 6:55, when the chime struck 7, you entered the room with a pretense, a question perhaps, and struck him from behind. You had 5 minutes before anyone noticed the sound. Claude was silent. You then locked the door, from the inside, exited through the servants' corridor that connects to the pantry, Camilla's pantry, and doubled back up the attic stairwell. There, you retrieved the forged will planted earlier. But Camilla had already found it, hadn't she? So you returned to the study later that night to recover the now empty envelope. Wolfe's voice dropped. "That is when Vincent caught you, coming down the hall." Claude's lips parted, and for a moment I thought he might speak. But it was Marjorie who broke first. She stood. Again. "This is nonsense," she said. "You're grasping." "No," Wolfe said calmly. "I am reconstructing." "And you think a fibre and a clock prove murder?" Wolfe gave the faintest smile, the one that means someone just handed him the nail to close the coffin. "No, but your own words do." He looked toward me. "Archie?" I flipped open my notebook. "Yesterday, Miss Winslow said Bartram had written that he wanted to have everything squared away before he signed the new draft. She used it as proof the will was authentic." Wolfe nodded. "But that phrase, squared away, does not appear in any of Bartram's letters, journals, or notes, except one. A private journal entry from 2 years ago. Quoting Abbott." Claude stiffened. "You were the source, not Bartram, and Miss Winslow's use of that phrase proves that you, Mr. Abbott, dictated the terms of the forgery. She was your tool. You were the hand. I didn't have to look around to know the room had gone dead quiet." Claude swallowed. For a man usually flushed, he looked suddenly carved in marble. And then, finally, he spoke. I didn't mean to kill him, just to scare him. He pushed me. No, Wolfe said softly now. He trusted you. Claude slumped in his seat. Camilla let out a soft, trembling breath, and Winslow, she sat down slowly, as if her knees remembered something she didn't want to. I stepped toward the phone. Wolfe looked at me, then closed his eyes. "Call Inspector Kramer," he said. "You wouldn't think a double confession, one for forgery, one for murder, could be considered a quiet evening. But that's the Wolfe household for you." The suspects departed in silence, trailed by Kramer's usual squad of unsmiling bluecoats. No shouting matches, no arrests over broken lamps, not even a slammed door. Just grim faces and resignation. Classy crimes get classy endings, I suppose. Kramer stuck around long enough to grumble. "You couldn't have just handed me the name, like a normal person?" he asked Wolfe. Wolfe had one foot on the runner rug and both eyes on the stairs. "I have no interest in normalcy," he said. "I have orchids." And that was that. I saw Kramer out, past Fritz in the hall and court, the faint aroma of his celebratory roast duck. Wolfe's reward to himself after an intellectual conquest. It wasn't even 6:30, and the day was already being swept under the rug like a wine stain we didn't want to explain to company. I wandered back into the office and stood there a minute, listening to the grandfather clock tick like it had done nothing wrong all week. The fireplace crackled. My desk was clear. Even the globe looked satisfied. Wolfe came back down 15 minutes later. Clean suit, fresh shirt, mood restored. I handed him a glass of beer and said, "Another one for the books." He nodded. "The woman, Miss Winslow. She forged the will for self-preservation, not greed. That distinction should be made when the papers write it up." I arched a brow. Feeling generous? Merely precise. He settled behind his desk like a battleship, easing into dock, and took a slow sip. Then he stared at me. "You disapprove," I shrugged. "Not exactly. But it does strike me that if Bartram had just tossed the old will, or used a lawyer who didn't golf with half the suspects, we could have avoided a whole week of chaos." Wolfe grunted. "You object to being useful." "Useful's fine. It's the danger I find redundant." He ignored that, as usual. Instead, he lifted his glass toward me in a half-toast. "You managed, Mr. Goodwin. Better than I expected. Praise," I said, "from Nero Wolfe. Shall I record it in the ledger, or have it bronzed?" Wolfe exhaled long and slow. The sound of a man releasing a puzzle from his mind like a balloon into the sky. "I shall be upstairs with my orchids," he said. "You may field the inevitable calls." I saluted, as always. He rose and lumbered off, the stairs creaking under his considerable weight like they'd missed him. I waited until he was out of earshot, then pulled out my notebook and wrote the final line under the day's account. "Case closed. 1 murder, 2 crimes, 3 ruined lives, and 4 witnesses left blinking. All because a clock couldn't keep its mouth shut." I leaned back in the chair, kicked my feet up on the corner of the desk, and watched the shadows from the fire lick across Wolfe's empty chair. Another one solved. Another one put to bed. Now, if only the phone would stay quiet for 24 hours. But that's a different mystery. I've learned over the years that Nero Wolfe doesn't celebrate victories like you or I might. No fist-pumping, no back-patting, not even a second beer, unless Fritz is feeling pushy. For Wolfe, solving a murder is just a restoration of balance, a cosmic pantry put back in order. And once that order is restored, it's back to the orchids and reading Thucydides like nothing ever happened. Still, I wasn't quite ready to let this one fade into the wallpaper just yet. There was something about it, maybe the antique clock, maybe the soft-footed killer in wool slacks that clung like cigar smoke. So that night, while Wolfe was somewhere upstairs fussing with a defiant hybrid of Paphiopedilum, I sat down at my desk and called Camilla. "Miss Bartram," I said when she picked up, "this is Archie Goodwin. Just checking in to make sure you're sleeping in a house without ghosts tonight." There was a pause. Then her voice came through, light, but not brittle anymore. "I think the ghosts are quieter now. Thank you." "You did fine," I said, "and Wolfe wants you to know your memory is better than most congressional transcripts." That got a laugh, small but real. "You know," she added, "Lawrence was always proud of that clock. He said it was the one thing in the house that ran honestly, even when he didn't." I didn't know what to say to that, so I let the silence fill the line for a few beats. Then I said goodnight and hung up. By the next morning, the reporters had started calling. Wolfe gave them nothing except an irritated grunt and a few overripe metaphors about intellectual hygiene. I handled the rest, which is to say, I lied artfully and got 2 offers for coffee from enterprising young crime columnists. Wolfe would be appalled if he ever thought I'd say yes, which I wouldn't. Probably. Mid-afternoon, Saul Panzer dropped by. Wolfe gave him a nod of respect, the kind usually reserved for Fritz's béarnaise. Saul took it in stride and asked if Wolfe needed him on anything. "Not today," Wolfe replied, "unless you've taken up rewiring clocks." "Nope," Saul said, standing, "but if one ever explodes, you'll know who to call." He was gone by 3. Fritz served roast beef hash with poached eggs at 4, and by 5 the house had fallen into that particular kind of peace we get when crime has been escorted out the front door by men with badges. Wolfe sat in his chair, eyes closed, breathing, like a man who's outwitted chaos once more and has earned his quiet. "You still thinking about it?" I asked. His eyes didn't open. "The mechanism of deceit interests me, not its residue. You don't feel anything for Bartram, or even Winslow?" "Feel? No. Observe? Yes. They were tools used by a man who saw his ruin and chose violence over confession." I grunted. "You make it sound almost noble." "No," Wolfe said, and his eyes finally opened. "I make it sound logical. That night I took the long way home from the corner deli. The spring air had teeth in it, but the city was humming like usual. Somewhere a saxophone drifted through an open window, and someone laughed too loudly 3 blocks away. I passed a pawn shop. Its window had a busted old grandfather clock in it, stopped at 7. For a second, I stood there staring at it, listening for something. Tick, tock. Then I laughed to myself and kept walking. Because some clocks run late, some run early, and some just chime for murder.